I'm going live. Hello, everybody. We are back. Hello, hello, hello. So we are doing St. Bernard's books. St. Bernard's books with Mrs. Brickson, number 19. Can you believe it? It is April 15th, 2020, in the middle of the COVID stay at home time. We are currently reading Holes. And for those of you just joining us, if you please just do a shout out in the comments. Please say hi so that I can kind of see who's here. With some of the new settings, it just doesn't pop up anymore. But anyway, I am excited to be going and starting doing holes. Today's Wednesday, so I have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and we are going to try to. Oh, and I think I just lost the page. We are going to try to go and read the rest of the book. And hold on, we're going to try to finish the book by Friday. So Friday, hopefully, we'll be able to be done. So then Monday, we're going to start a new book, and we are going to read. We are going to read How to Eat Fried Worms. Now, I know that some of you are reading a part of it, like a chapter of it, and in your reading book, I think the second graders are. This is a really funny book. This is one of my favorite books. This is one of those where don't see the movie. The movie isn't even close to the book. The movie is very different. And yeah, it's not really good. The movie, but the book is really good. But we're going to do that Monday. It's really funny. So I'm trying to kind of go back and forth with different books for different people. Anyway, what we're going to do, because I have a lot to read today. Again, remember, if for some reason you end up missing a day, you can go to this website. And this is my YouTube playlist that has all of the former events on it. So with that, let's go ahead and we're going to get started pretty quickly on things. Excuse me. Here we go. Difference. We can make a difference. Go make a difference in the world. Go make a difference. We can make a difference. Go make a difference in the world. Awesome. Okay, guys, here we go. And we have for us our joke for today is the joke for today. And I'm doing this one in honor because we had Mexican restaurant last night, and we got like family style. So we got like it was like a container of 15 street tacos or like smaller tacos with steak in them with all the different sides, like rice, beans, and with this really good white queso. Mwah. So all you out there, I really encourage you to support our local businesses, and every once in a while get a little something on takeout. So I'm picking this classic joke. What do you call a cheese that isn't yours? What do you call a cheese that isn't yours? Okay, let's all say it together. 3, 2, 1. Nacho cheese. I bet you knew that one. I had to pull that one. Thank you. Classic. It's a classic. Thank you. I know. So I am kind of moving rather quickly into this, and let's see if I'm not even sure who we have coming in. Because it's not showing me anything. All righty. But what we have here is we have on chapter 31, if you're following along, it is page 141, chapter 31. Okay. And so remember last time when we left off, Stanley is teaching Zero how to read. And in return, Stanley, or Caveman as they call him, Zero is digging part of Stanley's hole. So he's not so worn out and he's not too tired. So then what happened is like the rest of the boys got really mad at him for having somebody else dig his hole. They're just like, hey, that's not fair. So then they ended up getting in a fight. And so then that ended up bringing, they ended up bringing like Mr. Podansky and the warden came out and all of these people came and they were really upset and like, hey, they're trying to stop this fight that was going on between the boys. Well, then they kind of came out, everyone kind of found out about the teaching and the warden was not having it. And she was like, you're not doing that again. And, she even kind of quizzed Zero. It was like, well, do you know this? Do you know how to spell cat? And all that kind of stuff. And so, but then what happened is, things just really end up getting more and more trouble. And so Zero decided he is done digging holes, period. No more holes for him. He's like, I'm done. I'm not digging any more holes. I hate digging holes. So then what he did is he took a shovel for digging holes and he swung it like a baseball bat and hit Mr. Podansky with it and essentially ran away. And he ran away again to remember this is a really dry area. It's a dry lake bed. There's no water. And so the warden's like, hey, he's going to be back. He's going to be back and all that kind of stuff. So basically, let's see what is happening here. I'm going to try to read up to a certain point so we can get finished by Friday. Load it up. Make sure you say hi. Say hi in the comments so I can kind of see who's here, okay? Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Podansky, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, and his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly, he was angry with himself. He knew he should never let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then he should have been able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach. What he should do, he thought, is go after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake, digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go out after Zero. There's nobody to stop him. He kept thinking that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb to the top of the Big Thumb. Remember that? It was like a mountain, and it looked like a mountain like a fist, but with a thing going up like this, it looked like a thumb. If it wasn't too far away, and if it was really the same place where his great-great-grandfather found refuge, and if after 100 years or so, maybe water was still there. It didn't seem likely. Not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought, they'd still have to come back here eventually. And then they both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingernails. Instead, he came up with a better idea, although he didn't have it quite all figured out yet. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself into deeper trouble. She might just say, tell me where you find it or I'll scratch you. Plus, it would mean that X-Ray would get in trouble, and she would probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. So he dug his shovel in the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard at the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Pedansky had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. I always knew he was stupid, Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole the next day. As he dug, he kept constant watch out for Zero, but he never saw him. Once again, he considered going out to the lake to look for him, but he began to realize that he was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-great-grandfather found it, and for some reason his great-grandfather felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would find the same urge. If it was the same mountain, if water was still there. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago, and maybe Big Thumb was actually just some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't impossible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pedansky all waiting for him. Have you seen Zero? The warden asked him. No. No sign of him at all? No. Do you have any idea where he went? No. You know you're not doing any favors if you're lying, she said. Oh, whoops. You know you're not doing him any favors if you're lying, said Mr. Sir. He can't survive out there for more than a day or 2. I don't know where he is. All 3 stared at Stanley as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pedansky's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. You sure he has no family? The warden asked Mr. Pedansky. He's a ward of the state, Mr. Pedansky told her. He was living on the streets when he was arrested. Is there anyone who might ask questions? Some social worker who took an interest in him? He had nobody, said Mr. Pedansky. He was nobody. The warden thought about it a moment. Okay. I want you to destroy all of his records. Mr. Pedansky nodded. He was never here, the warden said. Mr. Sir nodded. Can you get into the state files from our computer? She asked Mr. Pedansky. I don't want anyone in the AG's office to know he was here. I don't think I can erase him completely from all state files, said Mr. Pedansky. Too many cross-references. But I can make it so it'll be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him. Like I said, though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni. Good, said the warden. Chapter 32, page 145. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray called him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long in Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire the engine all in less than 1 minute. I never planned to, steal one, he said. But sometimes, I'll be walking past a real nice car parked in a deserted area, and, I'll just start twitching. If you think I twitch now, you should see me when I'm around a car. The next thing you know, I'm behind the wheel. Stanley lay on his scratchy sheets. It occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away or if he'd just gotten used to it. You caveman, said Switch. Do we really have to get up at 4:30? You get used to it, Stanley told him. It's the coolest part of the day. He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he made it to Big Thumb or... What worried him the most, however, was that it wasn't too late. What worried him the most, what really ate his inside, was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling across the dirt, searching for water? He tried to force the image out of his mind. The next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch the requirements for his hole. As wide and deep as your shovel. Twitch fidgeted. His fingers strummed against the wooden shaft of the shovel. His neck moved from side to side. You wouldn't be twitching so much after digging all day, Mr. Sir told him. You wouldn't have the strength to wiggle your pinky. He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed them, spat out the shells. This ain't Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet and headed Twitch. What if it's not too late, he thought. He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive after more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He needed a car. Or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir left the keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window, and the keys were in there dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself and tried to think clearly. He had never driven before. How hard could it be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he'd have to do it quickly before Mr. Sir noticed. Before it's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it was too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. But there wasn't time to think. He flung open the door to the trunk and climbed quickly inside. Hey! shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped on the gas pedal. The engine revved, and the truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal to the floor, and the engine roared. But the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck. The door was still open. Put it in gear, said Twitch. The gear shift was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back to the arrow pointing to letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot was pressed to the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt. Suddenly, Stanley slammed forward and instantly backward as the airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay in the dirt, staring at the truck, which stuck lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather this time. This time, it was his own fault. 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest thing he had ever done in his short and miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but didn't think he had broken any bones. He glanced back at where Mr. Sir, who remained where he was staring at Stanley. He ran. The canteen was strapped around his neck. It banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. Chapter 33. He slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from back by the truck, but he couldn't make out words. Occasionally, he'd hear the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of Big Thumb. He couldn't see through the haze. Walking helped calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he could make it to Big Thumb with no water in his canteen. He didn't want to risk his life in the hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that, but he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later after everyone had a chance to calm down. And as long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided he would walk as long as he could until he was too weak to go any further, and then he'd turn around and go back. He smiled as he realized that wouldn't quite work. He'd only go halfway as far as he thought he could go, so he would still have strength to return. Then, when he'd have to make a deal with the warden, tell her where he found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube, and beg for mercy. He was surprised by how far out the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but he still kept on passing holes. Just when he thought he passed the last hole, he came across another little cluster of them, a little further away. Back at the compound, they had dug out a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here, there was no system. It says every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot at random and say, dig here. It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in a lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into each hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. After more than an hour had gone by, he thought he had surely seen the last hole. But then off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes. He saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole, and his heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow spotted lizards, those large red eyes looking up at him. He leapt back from the mound and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one leap up out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any further and then collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath. As he got back to his feet, he thought he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much, maybe just a big rock, but in a land of nothingness, any little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it. The encounter with the lizards had made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one Maiden had stolen from Mr. Sir, though that didn't seem likely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. Chapter 34. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk for no more than maybe an hour, maybe two, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all, thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away, where he was standing. He closed his eyes and he opened them to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried toward it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering of waves of heat rising off of the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put in it. And after a while, he thought he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if there was another kind of mirage, but the further that he walked, the clearer he came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain. It was more than halfway. He kept walking toward it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there, but every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked a little like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow here. More likely, it was a ridge of dirt and rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way to Big Thumb, but just off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or continue towards Big Thumb, or maybe just turn around. There was no point in heading towards Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all this nothing made it hard for him to pass up. So he decided to make this object his halfway point, and he hoped he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry and barren wasteland. But after all, he realized this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down and half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly. It seemed spot where he could actually well die of thirst. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled and faded, but Stanley could still read the name Mary Lou. One side of the boat where there was a pile of dirt and then a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred underneath the boat. It was coming out. Hey! Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry and it was hard to shout very loudly. Hey! The thing answered weakly. And then a dark hand in an orange sleeve reached up and out of the tunnel. Chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had just been left out too many days past Halloween. Half rotten, with sunken eyes and a droopy smile. Is that water? He asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white. His tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if getting in the way. It's empty, said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing that he was real. I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but he smiled sheepishly. I drove into a hole. I can't believe you're... Me either, said Zero. Come on, we got to get you back to camp. Zero shook his head. I'm not going back. You have to. We both have to. You want some sploosh? Zero asked. What? Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. It's cooler underneath the boat, he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him and was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He would never have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He had lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there, and then he remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Podansky. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat now, the roof, to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. What is that? Sploosh! His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. That's what I call it, he said. They were buried under the boat. He still couldn't get the lid off. I found 16 jars. Here, hand me a shovel. Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero, blade first. Sometimes you just have to, Zero said, and then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. Careful, Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off of that as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. Drink some. Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? It's good, said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had even heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed down his dry mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it had been some kind of fruit at some kind, perhaps peaches? Zero smiled at him. I told you it was good. Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many are left? He said. None, said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Now I have to take you back, he said. I'm not digging any more holes, said Zero. They won't make you dig, Stanley promised. They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barfbag. Barfbag stepped on a rattlesnake, said Zero. Stanley remembered how he had almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle. Come on. He did it on purpose, said Zero. You think? He took off his shoe and his sock first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. What's Mar-ye-lau? Said Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard. Mar-ya-lau. Low. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back out from underneath the boat. Stanley followed, and back outside he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. Maria Low. Okay. Oh, Stanley smiled. It's Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought the Y made a y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes the Y is a vowel, and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back towards Camp Green Lake, and at least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I've got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray? But the warden went crazy making us dig where she thought X-Ray found it. I think if I tell Warden where I really found it, I think she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at the mountain over there. You see the one that has kind of like something sticking up out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed a fist, and then he raised his thumb, and his eyes went from the mountain to his hand, back to the mountain. Chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars into the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack, and Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said, I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way that you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign and then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach and he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then, using the shovel, pushed himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign as they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at the big thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, and then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized they still had to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was a real person in a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting in the boat with her boyfriend rowed. Zero used his shovel as his third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I gotta stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. And Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade, and then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear very low moaning and some moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think he might need it to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again, flashing the thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant, and then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out. Run, run, run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted. As bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he would keep going too. It was possible, he thought, he hoped, that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs that couldn't get in either. And maybe the bacteria were only in the jars, which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying on his back. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death, he'd be too weak to feel pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them and when. What do you think is up there? Zero asked. Stanley looked to the top of the Big Thumb. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want ice cream sundaes, said Zero, with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually, as if they'd been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to figure out somehow to climb up it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about a foot wide and 6 inches deep running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. Well, let's try there, he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times he had used the side of the rut for support just to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out only just a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge, and Zero came up beside him. You okay? Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said Zero, and I'll pull you up with the shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, said Stanley. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero up high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below. Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack and then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half the blade was supported by the rock. The wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. Okay, he said. Stanley doubted that would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hand moved one over the other, up the shaft of the shovel, and he felt Zero's hand clasp around his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and with Zero's help pulled himself up the rest of the way up the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both his hands. He had held on to the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, and then they continued on up. It was a fairly easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball, balancing on top of Big Thumb. It's like God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. And I'm going to stop there. And so hopefully we'll be able to read for Thursday and Friday. We're keeping the other things short today, so we're not going to be doing a song. We're not going to be doing the full song, but just want to thank you guys for coming. I know there's a lot of reading today, and there'll be a lot of reading on Thursday and Friday so we can finish up the book. But please remember, guys, go forth, go make a difference. Love you guys, and I miss you terribly. Make a difference in the world. Go make a difference. We can make a difference. Go make a difference in the world. Go make a difference in the world. Go make a difference in the world. All right. It's great seeing you. Have a wonderful day. Get outside. Make sure you get outside.